Two titles released 2 years apart, and developed by two studios at the peak of their prosperous partnership. Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie are perhaps some of the most genre-defining games of their time, having set the template for open-world sandbox games later codified by Grand Theft Auto 3, as well as being the inspiration for countless other titles. Both games are some of the most important milestones met in the early stages of full 3D games design. However, you might be asking the question why, nearly 20 years later, should these games be reanalysed? This year sees a revival of this story genre thanks to two big releases, Super Mario Odyssey and Yooka-Laylee. Two titles from the original developer that returned to the examples set by their forebearers. This isn't to mention a number of independently developed games built by passionate fans of this long forgotten genre, such as the upcoming Hat in Time. For developers who have been inspired by their fond memories for these games, it's important to understand what made these two so popular in the first place, but equally as essential to examine whether lessons can be learned from their strengths and weaknesses. In this essay, I want to dig into the underlying mechanics and presentation of both games, compare and contrast them to one another, and make some points at their successes and failures. I will also be making some points regarding both their sequels and spin-offs, not to mention other games in this time frame that embraced elements of their design. By the end of it, I hope to bring light to some of the bullet points that the new wave of 3D platforming game developers could keep in mind when creating titles of their own. Without further ado, let's get into what makes these games tick. First, a quick history lesson. By the mid-90s, the success of Nintendo and Rareware's business partnership had bolstered the profile of both companies. Donkey Kong Country had given the Super Nintendo an edge over its competitors by reintroducing the classic arcade character with a state-of-the-art presentation. The technology that drove its pre-rendered graphics would later become the backbone of Nintendo's upcoming hardware, and the two companies were already ahead of the curve due to their early exposure. Nintendo had already started to experiment in the third dimension, with titles like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. Before the next console, they were fully dedicated to embracing this new technology. Super Mario 64 was developed from the ground up to be a set-piece game for the upcoming Nintendo 64, and would be Mario's formal inauguration into the third dimension. But the character had become beloved due to Nintendo's knack for finely crafted obstacle courses, bursting with personality and imagination. The decision was made to rebuild the Mario template from the ground up, while still retaining the appeal that all these original games had. The joy of Mario's jump. Perhaps the most important facet of 64's intentions, and one that informed all other design decisions made, is in how it presents the window to its world. Well, the original single-screen arcade games had given way to the side-scrolling Super Mario Bros. Series. 64 took the camera placement out of the developer's control and gave it directly to players. With the opportunity to point yourself in whatever direction you saw fit, changes were made to accommodate this new freedom. Levels were redesigned from linear obstacle courses into wide-open arenas. Platforming challenge was balanced with exploration and examination. Finally, Mario's movements were made more expressive and interactive, to better make use of these multi-dimensional environments. The game became something quite unlike anything people had seen before, including the developers at Rare. Banjo-Kazooie started life as an RPG game for the Super Nintendo, under the codename of Dream. This original game looked to do for the genre what Donkey Kong Country had done for platforming games. A highly ambitious title that built on the team's aptitude for pre-rendered graphics, stunning soundtracks, and fantastic world building, and taking cues from both role-playing and point-and-click adventure games. Its development would quickly move to the Nintendo 64 as it proved too large for the Super Nintendo's capabilities, and at this point took on further iterations, with its cast of characters, world design, and even protagonists transforming into what would reflect the final game. According to the developers, after seeing an early build of Nintendo's Super Mario 64, the team were inspired to hone upon a new intention for the game: to create a 3D adventure title built around the interface of a platforming game. Both titles were released to critical acclaim and stand as two best-selling games for the Nintendo 64. Nintendo would later expand on the outline of 64 with Super Mario Sunshine for the GameCube, and then reimagine it in Super Mario Galaxy for the Wii. Rare, on the other hand, followed up Banjo-Kazooie with a comparable Donkey Kong 64, and a true sequel, Banjo-Tooie, in the year 2000, before eventually partnering with Microsoft as a first-party developer in 2003. Nearly 20 years on, the games both remain influential and have seen re-releases both unchanged and reworked for new platforms, and it goes to show that these games still remain completely playable, though with varying levels of fortune. It's hard not to start comparing these two, so perhaps I should jump straight into my analysis of these two titanic titles. Secondly, some clarification. An argument can be made that the two games shouldn't be compared due to their ideological differences that came about as circumstances of their development. Super Mario 64 was designed to be a re-evaluation of Mario's 2D platforming in a 3D space, while Banjo-Kazooie came about as a transformation from a role-playing game into an adventure game. Yet, beyond their intended deviation, the two are built on a very familiar framework. Whereas a traditional platforming title would follow the task of completing levels in a linear fashion, both games use levels as hubs to access objectives, with tokens awarded as your prize for completion. These tokens are then used as currency to access more of your central hub and new levels as a result. If you could imagine a conventional 2D platforming game as a line drawn from the start of a level to the end goal, Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie instead is a series of lines drawn from a single point to multiple endpoints. Each level can be thought of like a snow globe, separate from the main hub with a unique landmark or gimmick at the centre of its design. This could be a mountain of each game's first levels, a snowman at the centre of a winter-themed environment, an Egyptian desert complete with pyramid, or a nautical level with a pirate ship as its central focus. Rooted in theme park design, these junctures can both be the setting of objectives as well as starting points for others, due to their proficiency of capturing a player's attention. Both games are built around using jumps, attacks, and basic NPC interaction as your main form of influence on the world. An obvious holdover from the 2D age, but reworked to better fit the scope of an open environment, with full 360-degree movement thanks to the N64's inclusion of a thumbstick. Not to mention a trigger button at the back of the controller that allows for quick access to an all-purpose modifier. Finally, both games follow an analogous presentation and narrative, set in bold and abstract worlds that play on well-known images, with the grand homes of the female leads used as a hub between fantastical levels. Graphics pop with bright colours and strong character design, and music by Koji Kondo and Grant Kirkhope respectively perfectly sets the mood for each level. Both protagonists are heroic misfits that use their special abilities to solve problems, on a quest to save damsels in distress from the clutches of monstrous villains that not only pose a physical threat, but taunt you every step of your journey. However, below the surface of their comparable appearances, the moment-to-moment gameplay of Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie couldn't be more conflicting. Using an open world and multiple objective design as their template, and making the in-between of objectives a key point of its design, Super Mario 64 makes its mechanics the star of the show, while Banjo-Kazooie makes context a more important facet. In other words, if Banjo-Kazooie is a theme park, then Super Mario 64 is a playground. To best explain what I mean, we'll have to retread a few of these common points and expand on them. Your main input with both games are jumps and attacks as previously stated, but how detailed they are very unlike. Mario's jumps are perhaps the most important aspect of the game, as they should be. Expanding on the original leap, Mario can also perform somersaults, backflips, ground pounds, long jumps, dives, and wall hops, and your proficiency with these abilities can make the difference between solving puzzles the intended way and high-level mastery the developers didn't intend. On the other hand, Banjo-Kazooie gives you a larger suite of abilities, and some of which you unlock later on in game in order to explore more of a level. Double jumps, air jabs, traversal up steep inclines and across dangerous ground, temporary invincibility, contextual high jumps and flight are just some of the special abilities you unlock. And this isn't to mention character transformations that retool your protagonist and control scheme in order to solve even more objectives. Of course, Super Mario 64 also includes some transformations, but these come in the form of special caps. These grant temporary changes to Mario's physical attributes and controls, such as turning him into heavy metal that sinks and walks across the sea floor, or grants him the ability to take to the skies. And like Banjo, these are used to solve a number of objectives. How the two games handle flight in particular shows the difference of their intention. In Super Mario 64, once you grab onto the flight cap, you can activate a glide either by shooting yourself from a cannon or at the arc of your triple jump. Once you're in the air, you have to manually maintain flight by pitching Mario like a scoop, pushing down into a dive and then pulling up as he plateaus for a burst of speed. The in-between of these objectives aren't then just about meeting checkboxes, but also about keeping Mario in flight and at the right elevation. Meanwhile, Banjo-Kazooie's flight is as easy as standing on a special marker and pressing a button, where you'll quickly translate from normal controls to flight in a slick animation. You'll constantly have a forward momentum and can use the control stick to change your direction. You slowly lose elevation over time, but you can use a currency known as feathers to remain in the air and gain height. In most cases, the game fully intends for you to use this ability to solve a multitude of prescribed challenges, but you can also use it to skip the in-between of other objectives. Super Mario 64's controls, then, are best built for platforming challenge, and perhaps capitalise the best on the benefits of full 3D control. As stated previously, there's a lot of headroom to their execution, and explains why the game has managed to maintain a healthy competitive scene since its release. Returning to both these games, I was surprised by just how much more I could do with Super Mario 64's control scheme than I could previously. And this feeling of mastery in particular was incredibly satisfying. On the other hand, Banjo-Kazooie's controls are more of a means to solve prescribed problems with very little room for improvement, which is an absolutely fair intention, though one that I didn't quite appreciate on returning to the game. However, where this latter game benefits isn't in the actual physical interaction of this in-between, but in the context of it. Whereas many of Super Mario 64's challenges are often dry affairs, such as collect 8 red coins, kick an enemy into a lava pit, climb a mountain. The imagination behind Banjo-Kazooie's objectives do a lot to make up for their very simple design. In the first level alone, you're asked to collect an orange for a chimpanzee, feed a totem pole with eggs, climb a termite mound, and collect 5 colourful mascots hidden in the environment. It also says a lot that, outside of the dry descriptions of Super Mario 64's level introductions, characters and anthropomorphized objects in the environment always intend their purpose in Banjo-Kazooie, including filling you in on their purposes within an objective. The reason that this game still continues to resonate with so many isn't because of how the objectives were designed, but how they were presented. How they use strange characters plagued with even stranger issues that you are asked to solve. As expected, when compared to one another, the two games falter in areas the others succeed. Banjo-Kazooie, especially on replay, suffers somewhat from its approach to gated design that practically forces players to find comb levels for tokens, either primary or secondary. Whereas Super Mario 64's castle allows a player to access an entire third of the game's content, including a third of its level count, after completing only a small handful of objectives at the start. Banjo-Kazooie separates Grunty's lair and its associated levels behind note gates, special ability checks and puzzle boards for every single level. While it's possible, due to their small size and simple design, to grind every level to 100% completion in order to meet these checks, and, if you're playing well, sometimes avoid them altogether. The game sometimes throws a spanner in the works by asking you to collect special abilities or secondary tokens from future levels in order to fulfill content in the previous ones. This disruptive design can be something of a pain to deal with, especially in later and more convoluted levels that require more backtracking and exploration to complete. Super Mario 64, on the other hand, feels far too much like a technical demo compared to the presentation associated with the previous Super Mario games. Of course, as the launch title for the first system of its kind, this lack of polish is to be expected, though you do feel it become more apparent as levels go on, as music motifs and graphical assets are reused, and objectives become more obtuse and harder to pass. Some in particular seem utterly unfathomable to complete without a strategy guide, and you'll find yourself hitting a brick wall on some of its more confusing challenges, especially if it's your first time playing the game. Unlike the lockdown nature of Banjo-Kazooie's levels, Super Mario 64's looser gameplay can be both a blessing and a curse. Where there is headroom for high risk, high reward gameplay, there's also a small number of quirks of the controls that, when unchecked, can hinder progress despite no fault of your own. And perhaps that's the biggest difference between them both. Banjo-Kazooie is a game that you can appreciate immediately for the creativity of its challenges and the worlds they take place in, but one that, on replay, loses its luster when you can no longer be surprised, and presentation becomes secondary to play. Super Mario 64 is a bold and confident game when you start it up, one where using only a limited range of moves and basic problem solving is only half the fun. When you get used to its systems and start to take a few more chances, the game suddenly takes on an entirely new identity, a toolkit where problem solving can be as creative or convoluted or quick as you can imagine. So, which one is better in the long run? Well, take your pick. Since their release, titles have picked and chosen elements of both games' design to expand on, and some have used them as seeds of entirely new ideas. Even Nintendo's closest competitor, the Sony PlayStation, had its take on the open world platformer formula with titles like Spyro the Dragon and Ape Escape, and other third-party developers soon followed suit. Super Mario 64's allowance for high-level play through the mastery of your controls, set in open arenas and tied between simpler objectives, gets systemised through an arcade sensibility in the Tony Hawk Pro Skater franchise, which takes this gameplay and staples a high score system to it. Whereas platforming high-risk manoeuvres was once for your own enjoyment in Super Mario 64, Tony Hawk actually rewards you for doing so, and a strict time limit perfectly encapsulates the speedrun sensation of risky Mario play. Donkey Kong 64 takes the gated progression of Banjo-Kazooie and ramps it up to its logical extreme, with 5 main characters, with 5 special weapons, 5 musical instruments, 5 sets of coloured bananas and special objectives to complete, and 5 suites of special moves you're asked to collect from level to level. The sheer amount of padding is quite something to behold. The game never quite manages to make any of its systems particularly interesting, either using them as checks to push buttons, or hiding tokens behind abstract minigames totally disconnected from the whole. Banjo-Tooie expands on the size of Banjo-Kazooie, and actually becomes something more of a half step between the original game and the open world sandbox that would become codified in Grand Theft Auto 3. The hub and levels in particular are presented to be parts of a large single world. Some objectives are designed to take place across multiple settings. Like its predecessor, these are all steeped in context, and some of the most memorable interactions have you affecting one level through another, or bringing a transformation or token between them. Super Mario Sunshine carries on much in the vein of its predecessor, but makes presentation a more important part of its package. The main hub and its levels are designed to be part of the same island setting. Progression follows a narrative, bookended with voice-acted cutscenes and set pieces, and levels and objectives are more tightly integrated than they were in Super Mario 64, where environments change drastically between challenges. Its inclusion of a water jet also adds an extra wrinkle to the original game's control scheme, making jumps easier to commit to thanks to generous hovering, as well as adding third-person shooting that feels well integrated within the game. Finally, Yooka-Laylee can modify the difference in level size between Kazooie and Tooie by letting you choose between using your main tokens to unlock new levels or expand previous ones. Adding new landmarks with new objectives does do a lot to refresh old levels, though their sheer size both before and after transformation spreads the Banjo formula a bit too thin. Objectives and their tokens are too far apart, and some of the tasks you're asked to complete haven't improved in sophistication since the days of the N64. It doesn't help that the game's sarcastic tone comments frequently on poor design decisions, but doesn't subvert expectations by improving on any of these problems. The upcoming Super Mario Odyssey looks to take the franchise's current 3D design and rework it for an open world formula. It's telling that, from the footage so far, levels are used more as hubs between the standardised obstacle course design of the newer 3D Mario games, as well as being the setting for scavenger hunt and exploration objectives that better fit the formula. So, is there a right way of creating a new 3D platform in this day and age? Well, it ultimately comes down to the intentions of the developers. Though, the strengths and weaknesses of Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie should be points that every designer looks at and reacts to. Banjo-Kazooie could have been improved by making its design a little looser, if its inputs could have had more unintended side effects that gave players more options when using them, or even in reducing the restrictions of its gated progression. Maybe by giving players more choice between what levels they'd want to complete first, or let them solve objectives without needing certain abilities or tokens to do so. Super Mario 64 on the other hand just needed a little more character, that its objectives had a little more imagination to match the creativity of its problem solving, that the worlds and challenges could have been a little bit better contextualised, and you were given a much better sense of what you were being asked to do. So, will both games succeed, and the bullet points of great design that you should follow are as follows. A strong central mechanic that the entire game is built to facilitate, where soft modifiers and contextual interactions only adds additional layers to what this mechanic can do. Platforming gameplay that challenges this central mechanic, and objectives that ask you to use it in an interesting way, or for an interesting purpose. Use an open world structure only if necessary. The benefits of one is letting players choose their own objectives and how to go about completing them, so problem solving shouldn't be locked down to a single solution. There's no right answer to whether you should have a lot of a little or a little of a lot, in levels or objectives, but the important point is that they're satisfying to engage with. Levels should only be as big as you can fill them, and the in-between of objectives should be as interesting as their prescribed problem. If your game is about climbing mountains or solving mazes, then have challenges built to make the most of these landmarks, not just the satisfaction of completing them. Mini-games are a good palate cleanser between platforming challenges, but the best use the game's central gimmick as your main mode of interface with these diversions. There's no need to add a first-person shooting section or a racing game diversion if you make these mechanics work in a different viewpoint or make them satisfying for circuit gameplay. A support for new players to understand the game from the get-go, but without locking down the design to deter high-level exploits. The game should be as fun to play the third time as it was the first time, and finding the perfect balance between polish and implications in your mechanics can help foster a community around the title. Finally, high quality graphics and sound are amicable goals for presentation, but characters' world building and writing can do a lot more to make these worlds more inviting. They shouldn't be overly juvenile or painfully mature, and should match the spirit of the games born from this central mechanic and gameplay. Too little can sometimes be as bad as too much, by letting the player craft their own stories through their problem solving, as much as the game's prescribed plot is a powerful tool to build good memories in the players. Of course, these points aren't a silver bullet for great games design, but they can be a starting point for thinking about how you can achieve similar results in your own games, and question decisions that you might be thinking of when it comes to creating the next big 3D platforming game. However, if you've sat all the way through this video and were waiting for an answer to which game is better, Super Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie, well, I have good news for you. In the pantheon of 3D platforming games, now and forever, the one true title holder is, of course, Buck Bumble.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. Bum to the bump to the bump to the bass. Bum to the bump to the bumble. Bum to the bump to the bump to the bass. Bum to the bump to the bumble. Bum to the bump to the bump to the bass. Bum to the bump to the bumble. Bum to the bump to the bump to the bass. Bum to the bump to the bumble. Bump to the boot to the boot to the boot boot. Bump to the bass to the bass bass. Bump to the boot to the boot.